Hi everyone and welcome back to the garden. It's a grey drizzly day here today, but it's perfect weather for ferns, and after the dry cold April we've had, a couple of weeks of slightly milder and wetter weather will really help them grow strongly. And today I'm not just looking at any fern, I'm looking at the best fern that you can grow in the UK, the most exotic looking, the most impressive, and I know I use the word favourite quite a bit, but these genuinely are my favourite plants. I think if I had to choose one plant from the garden in some weird sort of trolley dash apocalypse type scenario, I would choose a tree fern. I'm not sure how it would work in practicality, but they are genuinely my favourite plants. And today we've got this beauty here, which is going out into the garden. If you're looking at adding a tree fern to your garden this year and you don't know a huge amount about them, then this one is a Dicksonia Antartica. And chances are, if you've been searching for tree ferns or you might have seen one in a garden centre, this is a variety that you'll have seen. It's the most commonly available sort of tree fern in the UK, and it's also the toughest and the hardiest in our winters as well, which is why it's so popular. And at this time of year, when the new fronds are coming out, personally, I think that lime green is such a beautiful colour. It's such a zingy green. It might not show up very well on video, but it's the same sort of green you see in the Mycorrhizal leaves behind me. And to me, it just encapsulates that energy of spring, and it's such an amazing plant. Personally, I find them visually appealing on several different levels. So firstly, you've got the prehistoric look to them. I enjoy growing plants that have got that weird, unusual sort of vibe. Plants like the Mycorrhizal with its huge leaves, the Wallamy pine, pretty much any fern in the garden. When you look at it close up, it's got these sort of alien-like fronds slowly unfurling, and a tree fern is that on a massive scale. And secondly, if you're planting a jungle or tropical garden, I don't think there's one single plant that captures that exotic essence more than a tree fern. With these bright, zingy green leaves, I think they're just an amazing plant. And thirdly, even if it wasn't for any of the sort of exotic unusualness about them, I would just grow them purely because they're a beautiful plant. And even if you had a garden full of sort of native green plants and just had one of these, it would instantly transform that garden. A small courtyard, a shady garden, one of these, it would make the whole space just feel amazing. Other than this tree fern, every other tree fern in the garden here was actually brought from our old house, and some of those were actually potted, some of the larger ones. I had them in pots for between 2 and 5 years. I will actually be doing a video later this week on how to grow tree ferns in pots and a few of my thoughts on that, but some of them were also planted into the ground for a few years, dug up and then brought over. If you buy tree fern as a bare log or trunk, the first thing you might notice is that the fronds have already started growing, and we're now in the middle of May. Thanks to the colder start in spring this year, a lot of tree ferns that are actually already out in the garden have only just started unfurling those new croziers, but this one here is already well on its way, and that's partly because they're actually harvested over Australia, they're chainsawed off at ground level, and all the fronds are cut off. They're then put into a container. This does sound pretty brutal, but they're very tough plants. They're put into a container and sent all the way to the other side of the world, and obviously in those conditions they do dry out a bit, it's quite cold potentially, but when they get here, I think the first response is just to start growing. So if you buy tree fern earlier in the year, like this one, I actually picked it up, I think it was early April when I got it, we still had frosty nights. And tree ferns, they're very tough plants and they're very hardy. They can take really low temperatures in winter, but it's the top part of the plant that you need to protect. And the most vulnerable part are actually the new fronds as they're unfurling. So even though the plant would survive, if there's a severe frost, if there's a hard frost in April or May, it can wipe out this new growth, which would be a massive shame because you lose that flush and it's really going to set the plant back. So a crucial thing, and what I've done with this one, is I bought it back in April, but I kept it somewhere close to the house, just tucked in a corner where it's sheltered from any frost. Because obviously it's hard to put fleece over these fronds without damaging them, but you need to protect them from the frost. So what I would say, if you want to take a bit of advice, is if you buy one before the middle of May or before the last frost for your area, it's worth keeping it somewhere sheltered. I wouldn't necessarily say a greenhouse because it can be too warm in there, but just somewhere sheltered and protected from the worst of the frost. When you receive your tree fern log or trunk, the most important thing, and if you don't do anything else, do this, is to keep it damp. So when you get that log, you might find out it's really dry, and some people actually soak them for a few hours or a day or so. It does make the log really heavy, but I'd rather have a happy tree fern. It's definitely worth the effort. Tree ferns, they come from Australia, but they come from forested areas. So they're not a plant that likes to, say, sit in water necessarily. Obviously, they can be happy in those circumstances, but they're a plant that comes from an environment with a lot of moisture, a lot of humidity. And I will touch on this in a future watering video, but for tree ferns, it's not so much watering that's the issue. It's more about creating that environment, creating that sort of damp humidity. That's the key thing. And for that, I personally get a hose, or you can use a bucket and rainwater if you're really going for it. But I use a hose and just spray the whole trunk down. So what you need to remember is that all the trunk is actually roots, so it's important that you create that humidity around the whole plant. And the easiest way to do it is just literally get a hose, put it on a sprinkler and just go for it for about 30 seconds. In the summer, this does mean doing it every single day, but they're absolutely worth it. And once they're settled in, they're generally alright. It's not just the summer though when you need to water them, it's also winter. And in theory, well, I've actually heard this, that more tree ferns actually die due to drought, due to drying out, than actually die from the cold. So it's really important when there's dry spells in winter or in spring like we just had, that you do keep your tree fern damp. Just give it a good soak in every 2 or 3 days, but then up that to maybe every day in summer, just so it really settles in and puts out some huge fronds. Tree ferns then usually come from forested areas, areas with high rainfall, and in theory that makes the UK absolutely perfect for them. And if you've seen Kells Bay over in Ireland, it's absolutely incredible, they've got a whole forest of them there. Likewise, gardens in Cornwall, like Treby, Helligan, it's absolutely amazing just to see them there. They're actually self-sown, and the fronds there are probably 3 times as long as most of the ones you'll see in people's gardens. They're just incredible things. And I think if you've got the right spot for them, they can grow somewhere like that without any care, so much better than one that's in a garden that does get care. But the best thing that you can do to really improve how your tree fern looks and its overall health is just to keep that consistent watering up. I actually did a bit of an experiment at our old house, unscientific, but I had 2 tree ferns with a 1 metre or 3 foot trunk. I don't know why they're still sold in feet when everything's metric, but that's the way it is. I had 2 of them and they're both in similar sized pots. One of them I had close to the house where it did receive more sun, and the other was actually in a shade house at the end of the garden, which sounds fancy, but it was actually just a car garage, a metal car garage sort of structure with some shade cloth tied to it. That fern obviously had a lot more shade, a lot more shelter from the winds, and the fronds probably grew definitely 50%, maybe more than that longer. So if you've got the right environment, a tree fern will absolutely thrive. I appreciate it's all well and good talking about the optimal home for a tree fern and how you could create an ideal home under a canopy of mature trees, but most gardens don't have that luxury. And if you've got a small or city garden, you might not have a choice but to grow it somewhere that's in full sun. All I would say is, preferably choose somewhere that's sheltered from winds because they can really dry it out, and if you do grow it in somewhere that's got more sun, then give it more water to make up for it. When it comes to soil, this is the next thing that you can do to really help your tree fern settle in. They won't like a sandy soil, but equally they won't like a hard clay soil either. And the best thing you can do before planting your tree fern is to dig in organic matter. And if you watch a lot of my videos, you might be fed up with me saying this, but it really is the best thing you can do to improve your soil for a lot of different plants. Tree ferns like the moisture then, and they're like a good soil structure they can just sink the roots into. So if you add some composted manure, some soil conditioner, anything like that will help break the soil down. Whether it's sandy or clay, it'll help it hold on to more moisture and give it a better, more crumbly structure so the roots can sink into it. And a tree fern with a better root system is one that will have bigger fronds and be happier and healthier and be able to tolerate periods when you maybe don't water it as much really well. On a practical note, I would also say that it's worth planting your tree fern somewhere where it's easy for you to water it. I know it sounds basic, but if you're planting it at the far end of your garden where your hose doesn't reach and the soil's naturally quite dry, it's always going to struggle and you're never going to water it as much. So it's just worth keeping it in mind. You want it somewhere that's easy to access and easy to water it. When it comes to feeding your tree fern, I will be covering it in a future video, so I know it's a popular topic. But for now, let's just say they're not heavy feeders in the same way that a banana or canna is. With a lot of these tropical summer plants that put on a lot of growth and big leaves in a very short time, they need a lot of nitrogen to support that. And they're naturally heavy feeders. So plants like the Ensete ventricosum, Musa basjou, cannas, even tetrapanax, they really respond well to lots of fertiliser. So they'll get bigger leaves, they'll grow faster. With tree ferns, that's not the case. And if anything, you need to underdo it, or maybe even not feed them at all if they're in the ground, rather than giving them too much. So naturally, woodland plants, they're not heavy feeders as such, they just need a good soil. And if anything, if you invest the money that you would have spent on feeds into organic matter, like composted manure, something like that, to improve the soil, that is pretty much all you need to do, and you'll get better results from that. Or even better, put that money into water on your water bill, give them more regular watering, and they'll respond so much better. If you do want to feed your tree fern, that's absolutely fine and something you can do if you haven't got an especially good soil. Then what I do is I either use chicken manure pellets or blood, fish and bone. I've got some links to these in the description below, and you can just sprinkle those on the soil around it. I won't put them straight into the crown because they might end up burning the new growth, but just sprinkle them onto the soil. And around April, May is a good time for this because the nutrients will slowly seep in and support that new growth. You can add those to the ground, or you can buy a specific tree fern feed from HSK. They do little bottles of it, or you can use a dilute liquid seaweed and just apply that maybe to a bit of the trunk or just that general area, and those will help support the growth. But like I say, they're not essential, and the feeds are more of a top up, when in reality, if you've got a good rich soil, you give it plenty of water, that is all your tree fern needs. You might have read about tree fern crowns narrowing or have worries about when to chop the fronds off. I will do videos on both those topics in the future, but let's just say a couple of basic tips for now. The most important thing that you can do is to water your tree fern a lot. If you give your tree fern a lot of water, then that crown will develop strongly. So when we talk about crown, it's basically this growing point in the middle. And if you don't give your tree fern a lot of care, that will actually sort of shrink down over time. Obviously this trunk has only got that fat by growing in an environment that's, you know, really good for it, with a lot of humidity, a lot of moisture. And in the UK, that is going to narrow to a certain point, because no matter how much you water it, you're never going to recreate that sort of, you know, forest environment. But to keep it as healthy as possible and to get this trunk sort of growing at that sort of width upwards, you need to give it as much moisture as possible, otherwise it will narrow over time. And when it comes to chopping off fronds, all I'll say in this video is don't chop off fronds when they're green, and there's no need to chop them off before you put the winter protection on. What you might find if we have a mild winter, or if you live somewhere like London or the south coast where your winters are naturally milder, or even if you've got your tree fern planted in quite a sheltered spot, maybe close to a house or wall where that heat radiates from it and just protects it a little bit, is that you actually get green fronds from the previous year. They stay on, and to me it really adds to the look of the plant. When you've got the older sort of darker green fronds and those new bright zingy ones, it just looks absolutely amazing. So if there's any way that you can leave those fronds on, absolutely do it. It helps the health of the plant, because as those fronds droop down, the weight of them helps to actually open that crown up and gives more room for new fronds to develop. But like this previous winter, a lot of mine are actually brown and look a bit toasty at the minute. I'm just leaving those old fronds on. Some plants are actually leaving them on sort of long term because I like the look of it and will just want to try to see how well they grow for actually leaving them on. But others, I will give them a tidy up, maybe in a few weeks when the new fronds have actually started to unfurl a bit more. When it comes to winter protection, I will be doing some videos on this closer to the time. We're now in May, so we shouldn't be talking about it. But just to give you a rough overview, what I tend to do in winter is put some straw in the crown of the plant. So as these fronds grow, spread out, you'll have an area there in the middle where you can just push some straw into. Or you can use a ball of fleece, anything like that really. And that just protects the growing point. And the main thing you want to protect it, it's not just the cold, but it's from that rain coming in and freezing solid. So you still need to water your tree fern when there's mild spells, when there's dry spells. But if there's sort of very frosty temperatures or sub-zero temperatures, I personally don't water the actual crown itself. You can maybe give the actual plant a bit of a dusting now and again, but you really don't need to give it too much water then. And the important thing is to actually protect the crown. My first step of protection is to put the straw or ball of fleece in the crown, and I tend to do that maybe say late November, December. It really depends when we have that first sort of real cold spell. So we're talking temperatures probably less than freezing. I'll put that straw or fleece in then, and that pretty much stays there all winter. And then I just really keep an eye on the temperatures, and if it looks like we're going to have real sort of sustained cold or anything less than -2, -3, I might then put a bit more fleece, just wrap it around the top sort of foot or so with trunk, just to give it that extra little bit of protection. When you buy a tree fern or palm here in the UK, you often see just one figure as the hardiness rating. It might be -8, -10, and that's really the limit of how much these plants can take, but it doesn't tell the whole story, unfortunately. And the reality is, even in milder temperatures, you can still suffer damage or lose a plant, because it's the duration of the cold, it's where you've got it planted. In the case of palms, a smaller plant's nowhere near as tough as a bigger one. So what I would say is, personally, if I see a -4, -5 forecast, or I get the impression from people on Facebook, people in the weather forums, that there's going to be a real sort of severe duration of cold, then I actually just wrap the whole plant up. It's worth doing just to be on the safe side, and you never know if there's -5 forecast. If you live somewhere rural, you might be a couple of degrees lower than that. If you have snow cover, that means that the air above it gets even colder, so you can have another couple of degrees colder. So a -5 to -6, especially when you take into account how inaccurate some weather forecasts can be, you can soon be looking at -8 or even worse. And if that's spread over a few days, that is the sort of weather where you can lose plants. So for me, for the sake of a few pence for a roll of fleece, or maybe a few quid, but you know what I mean, it's worth just spending that extra little bit of money. You can save it for next year, just wrap it up, and you've got that plant to enjoy for years to come. But anyway, that's enough of me waffling on. I try to put as many care tips in these videos as I can to help as many of you out as I can with these amazing plants. It's now time to plant the tree fern. And what you'll need, obviously the tree fern, you'll need a spade, and you could also do with something to actually prop it up, especially if you bought it as a bare trunk. This won't be so much of a problem if you've actually bought it potted, but you need something to support it and keep it upright, especially if there's wind or heavy rain. Best thing that you can use if you've got a taller tree fern will be a stake. I've seen some people just put one stake, tie them to it, or maybe even put a few stakes or posts around it just to hold it up. So whilst you buy your tree fern as a bare log or trunk, they do actually develop quite a big root system over time. It might surprise you, but they actually put out a mat of roots that does spread quite far, and once it's been in a few years, you'll really have a lot of effort actually trying to dig it up. I know I did at the old house, and they'd only been in for a couple of years. So it's a bit of a myth that they don't need any soil. They definitely do, and a plant with a bigger, stronger root system will have bigger, stronger fronds. It's that simple. So what you'll need really is just something to hold it up for maybe 6 months to a year. If you plant them in spring, I think you need something realistically that's going to last a year. I think a lot of the rooting's done in winter. I don't know if that's scientific or not. It might just be because we have more rain in winter here, but they seem to put the roots down quicker in winter, so you might not need something quite as permanent then. But with this one, with it being about 4 foot tall, I'm going to put some rocks around it just to hold it in place and without detracting from the aesthetics of the garden. If you've got some mycorrhizal fungi like this, then you can use them with your tree fern. And I don't like the word fungi. It removes a lot of the dad jokes that you have with fungi, but it is what it is. I'll put a link to this in the description below. If you're not familiar with the product, then basically we're finding more and more about how plants have relationships with organisms within the soil. Relationships that work both ways. The plants feed these fungi and they help the plant. So the idea behind it is that these are a dried form of the fungi and they actually interact with the roots when they're activated, which is basically when you add the water to them. They help build up that colony that links the plant to the soil, and in theory it doesn't need as much moisture over summer, and it's going to be a plant that can tolerate drought better. Personally, I don't say you need to use this with all your plants or that I've had proven results from it. If I had, then I definitely would push it. Obviously it's hard to prove these things, but my own personal reservations are firstly that these are obviously a dried product. How many of those fungi are actually alive when you actually put them in contact with the plant? Is it something that is worth spending the money on? And secondly, you might only have a few sorts of fungi in here. And if you look at the amount of ecosystems and, you know, habitats around the world, how many different sorts are there? And will these actually work with the tree fern? So if you've got some, I would definitely put them on just for the chance that they might help. With it being a woodland plant, I think you've got more of a chance of maybe a palm or sort of arid plant like an agave. If you've got some, use them, but if you haven't, I wouldn't worry about it and I probably wouldn't go out and buy some specifically for it. So first things first then, you want to find the right spot for your tree fern. So here, it's actually going to my woodland clearing area. I'm not showing you any more of the garden on purpose, just to save a bit of intrigue for that next garden tour. But it's in a lovely shady spot. I've got a big cherry tree just sort of overhanging the area, and I think it's going to be absolutely great. It'll be a nice spot where the soil's damp and it's good rich soil. But what I did to help build on that is at the back end of last year, I spread some farmyard manures and mulch onto the soil, and now the worms have brought that down. So it's helped add more nutrients to the soil, more organic matter, and now it'll hold on to even more moisture. So in theory, I've done everything I can to create the best home for this tree fern. When it comes to design, I have done a couple of videos looking at designs for tropical gardens and plants, but I'm using this tree fern as a sort of pattern throughout the garden. And I appreciate that tree ferns are quite an audacious plant to just repeat and have it, you know, throughout your garden. They're quite an expensive plant to do that with at this year's prices as well. But I've got a taller one in my distance that I've had for a number of years that I planted out last autumn. See, the idea is this one here is a smaller one just to help lead your eye through, and having a lot of the same plant really sort of ties the garden together. So now that I'm happy with the structure of the soil, I've dug a hole for the tree fern, and I've dug it to just a bit wider than the diameter of the trunk and around 3 or 4 inches deep. And as I'm doing these hand signals, I can pretty much see the meme already appearing, but 3 or 4 inches is about right for a tree fern. I know it's a question that gets asked a lot about the right planting depth. That's what I tend to go for, because obviously on one side you want the healthy plant that's got a lot of rooting contact with the soil. The plant will develop its own root system a lot faster, and you definitely don't want that plant sat on the soil, because if that trunk's just touching the ground, even if you water it every single day, that top layer of soil is going to dry out pretty much every day in summer, and the plant won't be able to get its roots down as quick. It'll struggle for water, and the crown the next year won't be as big. So you want to just give it a little bit of depth, but equally you don't want to sink it too deep, because obviously tree ferns are very slow growing, and as I said in previous videos, you want to choose a tree fern that's the right height for your garden straight away. There's no point wanting a 5-foot tree fern and planting a 2-foot one hoping that it'll grow there. Obviously it will, but it'll take a lot of years to do it. They grow between 1 centimetre, maybe 1 inch to probably even 2 inches at uppermost every single year. So you need to choose one that's the right size. And if you buy that, you don't then want to sink a foot of it into the ground. You're losing a lot of that height straight away. And obviously on a practical level, there's the money side of things. When I bought a lot of my tree ferns, they were $17.50 a foot. They're now probably even triple that at some places. So you don't want to lose too much money by sinking that plant too deep into the ground. So for me, around 3 to 4 inches is about the right compromise. So it's now time to get the tree fern out of the pot, and what I'm hoping might happen here, this is a little free tree fern hack for you. A lot of the time, if you buy one potted, so in the case of this one, the pot's around 10 inches tall, but the compost looks new. If it looks like that plant hasn't been in the pot for a long time, there's a chance that you might get some free trunk out of it. Anyway, enough talking, let's get on with it. It is heavy, but I don't think we need the dramatic music for this one. It's not the same as that Jubea, that massive Jubea in a 160 litre pot. I think a tree fern deserves something that's a little bit more chilled out. That's too far the other way. Do you know what? I think we'll get rid of the music for this one and I'll just have a go at it just as it is. Just enjoy the bird song. See, nothing to it. So I've made a bit of a mess, but with that tree fern, I actually got a few inches of extra trunk out of it, which at the price of this year, that's probably about the equivalent of saving 30 quid that you can spend on a meal out or another plant for your garden. I've left that above the ground surface, so now all I need to do is just bring that compost and soil around the plant, give it a good firm in, and then water it in. I nearly took out some of the Regersea shoots just coming up through there, but I'll give that a tidy up. The next thing I want to do before I put those stones around it, just to give it a bit of extra support, is really give it a good watering in. So typically, just as I'm about to water a tree fern, bright sun's just come out and it already feels a few degrees warmer. But I'm going to show you exactly how I water my tree ferns. And Max is inside while I'm doing this, well, for 2 reasons really. Firstly, he's lazy and likes to sleep most mornings. And secondly, this yellow hose recently started attacking it. So if I'm at the far end of the garden and I'm just pulling it along, he just thinks it's a snake presumably and just goes for it, which obviously isn't ideal. So I'll make sure I just give the whole plant a good soak in, right from the crown all the way down to the base of that trunk. Obviously if you've got water butts and you use a watering can with the rose, that's absolutely great. Pretty much every plant prefers rainwater to tap water, but with tree ferns, the more water the better really. So even if you've just got a hose, just go for it, it'll appreciate the water itself. And it's often a good idea to do a lot of your planting on rainy days or days after it's rained, so the soil's already moist. So now your tree fern's watered, the next thing is to increase the humidity. And like I said in a previous video on cheflorers, the best way of improving your humidity, obviously you need to plant your plant in the right place, so with a bit of shelter, a bit of shade, but it's to plant all the plants around it. Having more plants packed in really helps increase that humidity. And if you want some ideas of plants that you can plant with your tree fern, then I've got mine here with Gunnera, and then at the back of the border I've got cheflorers and a rhododendron. At the back there I've got some trees which will hopefully sort of grow up over time and create a nice sort of backdrop to it. But there's lots of other exotics that work really well with tree ferns. Plants like Regersea, which has got really big leaves that definitely fit in with a tropical vibe, but it's perfectly hardy. Hostas, and probably the best single plant, other ferns. They just look absolutely great together. Obviously, you can plant your tree fern with other plants like palms and more arid plants, but personally I tend to find it looks better and it's easy to look after a garden where you group plants with similar sort of requirements. So other woodland plants, other plants that appreciate a lot of moisture, I tend to put those around my tree ferns. I just think it sort of has a more natural look to it, especially if you're looking to create a more exotic woodland setting. There's so many amazing woodland plants that will just look perfectly at home with your tree fern. In terms of care going forward then, pretty much all there is to do is just to give it a regular misting. So as we're now approaching warm weather, every single day, most plants appreciate a good soak once a week because that encourages the roots to get deeper. But with tree ferns, you need to think you're not just watering the ground, you're actually trying to create that sort of moist environment around the whole plant. So a daily misting really helps and it's absolutely worth doing. And in terms of what to look forward to, what you find is that with small tree ferns, they send out fronds just one at a time as they slowly get bigger. But with big mature trunks like this, they'll send out one flush of fronds every spring. So they might do more, but realistically, they'll send out one flush and that will come around May time next year. So all you need to do is just give them plenty of water this year and give it good soil, and maybe put some manure around it as a mulch at the back end of the year, maybe in November time. And that's the best thing that you can do to help it settle in. So hopefully this time next year, you can remove whatever rocks or stake you put around it and you'll have an amazing plant and it'll put out even bigger fronds next year. They're absolutely fantastic plants and I hope this video has been helpful. But if you've got any questions about growing tree ferns, drop them in the comments below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.